Alright, we're on the home stretch now. In this lecture we're going to go over some functions that I find pretty useful, some standards that I think you should know when you're doing Excel, and of course a couple of tips for things I didn't get to cover during these lectures. Now let's start off. I'm going to speed run through these functions. There's a lot of functions in Excel, but I'm going to show you my favorite few that I use all the time. If I had to go and rank them in order of importance, aggregate functions, sum, min, max, and count A. These conditional ones, also very important. If error, super important. Search, find, super important. Trim, length, left, right. All of these right here, super important. So those are ones you're really going to want to know. And we're going to start out with the and or. And another thing I want to mention is that you may recognize these two tables here from the basics section. If you go ahead and rewatch that, we went over what these tables are. Essentially, this is a bank log right here of all your different payments. And this is just a couple of names with a couple of people that got some discounts. All right, starting off with the and or. You see we've got the same names from the data table 2 over here, but we're going to look for if they get both discounts or if they get either one of the discounts. That's what an and or an or does. It's really useful in an if statement, as I'm going to show you here. And you can see two different conditions. We can say for Annika, and I put these in the same order. So if Annika receives this, I'll say equals yes, or if student discount. And if both of those are yes, then 1. If either one of those are not yes, then it'll return 0. And as you see, if we go ahead and fill this down, only Ellis is the one that received both of them, both a senior discount and a student discount. Even though Annika up here did receive a student discount, she didn't receive both, so that's a no. But if we go ahead and we copy this over to the or, we're going to see a lot more ones show up because it is much more common for somebody to have at least one than both. And you see Sophia is the only one that did not get either discount. She is no. Those are two that can be pretty useful, but let's move on. We've got the row column. These are quite useful because it can be advantageous at times to get the reference for where the cell is. And you can leverage that in a lot of different formulas that I'll show you down here in the index. And so if we start off with the equals row, we can just type it, no parameter needed. You could input it with nothing and it'll return 33, 33 being the row that we're currently on. If I go and I copy this formula down here, where it's now to 34, but you can also put in a cell if you really want to. I don't oftentimes put a cell in there, but it is something you can do, and that's something you can also do with the column. You could just say equals column, and because we're in column B, it should return 2. And if we did that same formula, but we did it once again with C18, C is in column 3, so the column for C18 will return 3. Pretty simple. Don't need this here, because I'm going to make my own formula. If I type an index and I get this whole table right here, and for the row number, we could just do row minus 38 because we're in row 39. If we didn't put the minus 38 in here, it'd look for the 39th row of this array, and the 39th row does not exist, so we're going to go ahead and try and make it a little better. And then if we put the column, we are in column 1. So that is going to look for 39 minus 38, the first row in the first column of this array that we chose, which should return, yes, this very one. And we can go ahead and we can copy this into all of these cells, and we are essentially recreating it just like that. And you know, we could even transpose it if we went ahead and did that. And as you see, if we copied this into this table, it's going to transpose it, being it's going to rotate it. And as you see, look at that. It is now on its axes right there with all of the charge descriptions now in one row and everything else going below it. That's a pretty interesting thing you could do with the row and column. The row especially is useful in a lot of different scenarios. All right, sum, min, max. So these are the aggregate functions. There's a couple more aggregate functions down here that we're going to use. And this is very simple. You just put in an array of things that you want to sum up. Here we go. And the total amount of all of these prices right here is $15.94. And we can check that. If you highlight it, Excel automatically puts this in the bottom right corner. It automatically sums, counts, and averages all three of those. That's just one way to check. And when you go, we can copy it over here, and then instead of sum, we could use a minimum or min. And the minimum charge amount is 275. That appears twice right there on the bus. And we can do it for the max. 1200. 1200 being our mortgage payment. There are other aggregate functions you can use, such as the product and the average, but I don't use those nearly as much as the sum and the min and the max. Those three are quite useful. And for the count and count A, I don't use count that often, but I'll show you how it works. If we do a count, and that says the table from the last example, so all of these, it only counts the numbers that are in the array you chose. And so there's 3 numbers right here and 3 texts. So it's going to return 3. And yes, as you see there, it returned 3. And I'm going to copy it over here. And if I use count A counts the number of cells that aren't blank in the array that you chose. And so it returns 6 because all 6 of these cells have something in it. Whereas another example we could do is if we go up to data table 2 and we look at the schools, if we were to put those in here, or I'll just do equals count, and I go up and count the number of schools, 0, because it is counting, it's looking for the number of numbers that are in here. And there's no numbers, there's no decimal points or integers, and so it just returns 0. Once again, not a terribly useful function. Sometimes you'll need it, but really not all that often. Whereas you can go and you could copy that right in here. And if you count A, it will count the number of schools that are in this, and it looks like there are 2. Something that I think is much more useful. Anyway, those are 2 options right there. Now we've got the conditional aggregate functions, the sum if, the average if, and the count if. These can be quite handy for when you need them, because there's going to be times when you won't want to count or aggregate everything. And if we just start off with ones that we know, if we sum up the total charges up here, once again 1594, and we can copy that over here, and instead we can do a count, or count A, to see how many cells there are. 1594, and there's 10 of them, 10 charges. But let's say we only wanted the food charges. We can do that with a sum if. Sum if, the first thing you choose is the range, and the range that we are going to do is we're going to look at the food, and we're only going to sum if this is a 1. And you can do that by putting it in quotes if it's a value that you're looking for. If you put in a 1, it'll only look for a 1, and if it finds it, it will return the corresponding price in the sum range column that you choose. And that way you can say, based on this formula right here, you spent $160 on food. So 45 at the Sizzler, $12.50 at the Donut Star, etc. If we go over and bring it over to count, we can do the same thing. It's a very similar function, except you don't put in a sum range. You just put in the range and the criteria. And it says we have 4 charges at the food. Now if we're looking for the minimum charge, this is going to be a slightly more complicated formula, but it is something that you can do with a sum, and so I'm going to show you how to do it. In fact, it might just be easier to copy this down. Same formula, but instead of looking for 1, we're going to make sure that it is equal to the minimum. And instead of putting it in quotes, that means we put in a function here. We look for the minimum of these charges. And so it's looking in this range, it's looking for the minimums, and then saying if this charge is equal to the minimum, then sum it. And as you see, we have 2 minimum charges here, the minimum being 275. So we want to sum up both of those, which should return 550 if we did this right. And yes, very similarly, we can go and do the same thing for a count if. Count if. We just have to get rid of that. Look in that price range, look for the minimum, count how many instances there are of that. There should be 2. All right, the very last thing I want to show you is if you're not looking for the minimum charge, let's say you're looking for all charges except the minimum, you can do that with one of these conditional functions too. I don't know why you would want to look up everything except for a bus ticket, but you can do that. If I go ahead and copy these down, you can say greater than and minimum. So essentially what this does is you're putting it in quotes to where what this will return is F9 greater than 275. You can put this in here to tell Excel we want to look for everything that is greater than 275. I'm going to type it in there really quick to show you that this does work. It returns everything. As you see, this is the total, minus 550 is 1588. And we can do the same for the counts. Count everything that is greater than this minimum number, and it is 8. There are 8 charges that are not the minimum. That's just an interesting thing you can do with the conditionals, but moving on, we have the rounding. Rounding is nice. It's an intuitive one, as I wrote here. You just round it to the decimal places. This can be nice if you want to show, specific dollar amounts. Like I want to round it to the thousands of dollars, because I don't really care about the decimals if I'm looking for $18 billion charges. So, of course, we can go up here and we can sum up all this. And that is what we will be rounding. It says exact here, so I'll keep it like that. And that is the exact amount if we wanted to round it to 1 decimal place. So we wanted to round it to the nearest 10 cents. And 1 decimal place, the number of digits is 1. Pretty simple. And then it should return 1594.30. There we go. And we could do the same thing right here, except we round up and it should return the same thing, because rounding up from 0.25 is 0.3. Pretty simple, nearest dollar now. And you'll start to see the difference between these two here. So we round to the nearest dollar, the number of digits is 0. That's the number of decimal places. 1594. We can do the same thing here. Round up to 0 decimal places, now it's 1595. And of course there is a round down function, it works the exact same as round up. And to finish it off, nearest $10, you can go -1. If you put in a negative number, it'll round integers. So -1 decimal place, 1 decimal place away. If you put a -4, it'd round to the thousands of dollars. 1590. And you could do the same thing here, round up to the nearest $10, 1600. Because it goes up from 1595. That formula can be also useful if you're looking at numbers. Moving on, we've got the second to last calculation. If you have a text, value will convert it to a number, and if that text cannot be converted to a number, it'll give you an error. So the value of a number 1 should just be 1. Pretty simple. You can also do this by just adding +0 to it. It works exactly the same way. 1 plus 0, 0. And here we've got 002. Sometimes you'll see this for codes, and if you receive numbers in a text file, it can appear like this. There's a lot of reasons why you may have leading zeros in a text number. So if you just did a value of this text number, it is 2. And the same with, you could just add 0 to it. And of course, if we carried this down, you'll see that AA is not a number, so you'll return errors from both of these, value errors. Dates are stored as numbers in Excel. It starts at 1/1/1900, I believe, and so I don't know the exact value of this, but we're about to find out. Yes, so this is 32,000, being 32,800 days away from 1/1/1900, and the same with adding +0, we'll still convert it to a number. And true. And look at that. And I wrote here, this last one is strange. The value function does not give it a value, but if you use it in arithmetic, it defaults to 1. And that's quite interesting. I don't know why Excel has it programmed like this, that it doesn't give it a value, but you can add 0 to it. I've never had to take the value of a true, so that's just more like an interesting fact about Excel. And of course an if error. And we're going to continue using this value function that we had in the last one. In fact, I could probably just copy all of these down. If I copied all of these here, you see that we've got errors right here and errors right here. And sometimes we don't want to see errors. They can mess up our formulas. As we see, it's no longer summing in the bottom here because we have this error here, and the error messes up a sum. And what if we wanted to, we don't want this messing up our formulas. We don't want to see this because it's ugly. We can use an if error. And that's actually something that is quite helpful. You will use this a lot if you do any type of analysis in Excel. And then if you put a comma, you can say what value do we want to return if it's error. Sometimes you want a blank, and you can do that with 2 quotation marks. I'm going to say 0. So if it cannot be made into a number, just make it 0. And as you see, instead of returning a value, it's a value error, it is returning 0. Well, I suppose we should make this value to be consistent. This is an error, so it's returning 0. This is an error, so it's returning 0. And that's all the calculation functions. Hope that wasn't too bad, because now we're moving on to text manipulation, the search and the find. So reading the description of this, I wrote, for search and find, I still don't know the difference between these two functions, and that's very true, they do the same thing. You've seen the power of these functions in the basic skills practice problems, when we went and we tried to splice this up and find, is this food, is this rent, which these functions are leaning on right here. For these, you just input a string and character, and it'll return the number corresponding with the position of the character in the string. And these are really quite helpful for finding if text contains a keyword, but also can be helpful in parsing texts. And I wrote here, see the left, right, mid substitute, which is going to be in the next functions I show you. And so if we go and we try and find where food is, equals find, we want to find food, we want to find it within here. Pretty simple, this is at the 10th spot. And we can copy this down. This is giving a value error, meaning it cannot find food in here. This is at the 12th spot, so 12 characters in, at food starts. And this combos really well with an if error, as once again we saw, or we used is error, but if error works just as well. If I copy this over here, I can say if this is an error, then just return blank. And that can work really well like that. So find, you'll pretty much always need an error catcher, because these errors can definitely get in the way of things for you. Going on to left, right, mid. For the left, right, and mid, you input a string and it will result in a specified portion of the string from left, right, or middle of it. And it can be used in conjunction with the search find, as we learned this function up here, for an even more powerful string splitting. And I'll show you how that works right now. Pretty simple, if we just looked up the right 7 characters of this, you put in the text, you put in the number of characters, and it'll return, in this case, food. If we copied it down, rent, food, travel. In terms of finding what category this is, it's kind of clunky. There's leading spaces, there's parentheses around it. It's really not very good for finding which category it is. Now, what if we wanted to search for the left parenthesis? Find in this text, we wanted to find a left parenthesis. That can actually be quite useful. Nope, I put these backwards. There we go. So this is saying that this is 9 characters from the left, is the letter food, or is the left parenthesis. If we copy it down, we see 18 characters in is the left parenthesis. And so if we did this again, where we said we want 4 characters from this, we can say mid, this text, we want to start 9 characters in, and we want to look for 4 characters. In fact, it'll probably be better if we do +1, so we start at it. Or I should say we start at the character after the left parenthesis. If we copy this down, look at that. How much better does this group look than this one? It's a noticeable difference if we're looking for the group. It's not perfect yet, as this is giving us trav, and that may not be useful enough for us. Maybe if we wanted the whole thing, we could try it a little differently. But this is a much better start than this right here. I'm going to go and collapse that. Moving on to length. The length is going to help us find the number of characters of a certain string. For instance, if we wanted the length of this word right here, or this description, apparently this description is 14 characters long. And that's including Sizzler, the space, the parentheses, and food. Counting all of those as 14 characters. If we copy that down, this one's 23, which makes sense. It's a longer description. It's going to have a higher length. And once again, if we went up here, we could copy the search for the left parenthesis. Just finding a left parenthesis in this description. And then if we use these 2 formulas, we could have a much better result if we were looking to find the description of each of these. So if we did the mid of this, and we started at this description, or we started the left parenthesis +1, as we saw the same thing we did in the left, right, mid section. But the number of characters we're going to be using is the description minus this, and then of course we'll add +1, so to move 1 away from this, or I should say, put these in parentheses. And there we've got an exact return for the description, for the category of each of these descriptions. Now, of course, this can come with some hiccups. What if there's 2 left parentheses in here? Then what are you going to do? There are ways to deal with that in Excel, but I'm not going to go over that right now. But for now, this is actually pretty good. Going on to trim, the second to last text manipulation function. Trim is actually quite nice. It makes these descriptions look a lot better, and it also can be helpful if you're looking for keywords. It'll remove extra spaces, because what it does is any leading spaces it gets rid of, any trailing spaces it gets rid of, and any spaces between other characters. If there's duplicates of it, if there's multiple spaces, it'll reduce it to 1 space. So if we just took the raw length of this is 14 characters, and this with all of the extra spaces is 33 characters, a much larger description. But if we went ahead and trimmed it, you see they're now returning what appears to be a pretty similar thing. Oh, and this should say length trimmed description. And if we took the length of this, in fact we could just copy these because they're still relative references. See, now they're both 14 characters. Now they're the same description entirely now that they're trimmed. And that's something that a trim can be actually quite useful for. Once again, very useful function right there. Proper, lower, upper. A proper returns the inputted string into proper case. Proper case being, instead of saying, hi, my name is Brandon, it'll return it to say, hi, my name is Brandon. You see, it'll make the first letter of each word capitalized, separated by spaces. Lower makes everything lowercase, upper makes everything uppercase as if you're screaming. And so if we just quickly went through this, the lower of this is just Sizzler food, it no longer capitalizes it. The upper of this is Sizzler food, and then proper. It should look the same except food will be capitalized. Yes. And we could do that for all of these right here. And you see the upper one, there's a lot of screaming going on. The first thing that this is useful for, with proper, it makes things look good. Sometimes you'll have text descriptions that'll be all over the place, and you'll want to make it look nice and presentable. Upper and lower, on the other hand, combo really well with the find function. Find and search are case sensitive. See if we says equals find, if we're looking for this, inside of this, it'll say value, because it doesn't see these two as equal because they're not case sensitive, or because this is case sensitive, it says these two aren't equal. Whereas if we said find and we wanted to find the lower of this, so we convert all charge descriptions to lowercase, it now can find it. Sizzler food is at the first position, which makes sense. So that's something that lower and upper can actually be quite useful for. And that's all the text manipulation. Look at that, we're already 2/3 of the way through the functions. So for these last 4 date functions, and these are the least important of these 3 categories, but still important enough that I decided to show you. Just starting off with date, pretty simple. If you want to show a date, you can say equals date, the year 2020, the month we're going to make February, and the day we're going to make 27th. February 27th, a very important day to me. And you see it returns this very formula in a date format. But yes, this is how you do it. Sometimes it can be quite useful to want to make a date by inputting these different characteristics in it. So this can actually be a nice function. Moving on to today. This is a pretty simple function. You just say equals today, and it will return the date that today is. Year frac. This is the fraction of the year, or the date difference. Sometimes you're going to really need these formulas, sometimes you'll never need these formulas. I've been at different jobs when it's important that you know the difference between dates in Excel, and these are quite helpful, and I've been at jobs where I've literally never used this, so maybe you'll need it, maybe you don't. But if we want to return the difference between 2 days, let's just say I had 1/1/2000 and 1/1/2020, or maybe I could do, let's do May 4th, Star Wars Day. If we wanted to do year frac between these two, we can do this. The difference between these two is 20. and that returns, oh, I was going to say the number of years. There. And it is 0.3416 years from here to here. And it returns it in the number of years, which can be nice if you want a fractional year. Because date_diff does not give fractional years, it only results in integers. But you can specify I want it in days, months, or years, how far are they apart. So if I wanted date_diff, and I don't know why this is, but as you see, it's not even IntelliSensing giving us the option for date_diff. It's, I guess, a hidden formula that you're going to have to know, but I actually find it quite useful. Date_diff, and you can do the same thing, putting these same arguments, except you can say I want the number of days, lowercase d, between the two. 124 days from here to here. You can give it in months, 4 months from January to May. And if you look for years, it should return 0, because this is not a complete year. And that's why if you wanted it in decimal years, year_frac could be quite helpful. These both have situations when they could be good. And the very last one, something which is a really niche formula, but it's just nice to know, I'm just showing you. If we wanted the end of month of a date, let's say 2021-26, and we can input the number of months we want to advance this date. Or I'll go ahead and follow this for this example here to 27. The last date of it is 2/29. Oh, it's a leap year. That's nice to know. Whereas if we put 1, that means we're going to the end of the month and then adding another month on top of it. So it goes 3/31. That's the end of next month. And sometimes it can be helpful to know the end of the month. You can add 1 to it, and it'll give you the start of the month following. So April 1st. This can be helpful in niche cases. In fact, a lot of formulas are helpful in niche cases, so I'm not totally sure why I showed you this one. I guess just nice to know it exists. And that was it for the functions. Now we're just going to move on. I'm going to talk a little bit about professional standards when working with others, and some tips for finishing off this Excel training.